She is not a party to these proceedings. That was the official position of the Valhari Hegemony's Interstellar Arbitration Bureau on the matter of Kale Sarani, a human female, age 41, occupation listed as independent legal consultant. Standing request for observer credentials denied 4 times across 2 standard fiscal cycles. The log entry, Bureau Administrative Record 7741X, stamped and countersigned by the third notary of the appellate division, noted with characteristic bureaucratic economy that the petitioner lacks standing, institutional affiliation, and recognized sovereign backing, and recommended no further review. That log entry would become the most cited administrative document in hegemonic legal history, not for what it said, for what it failed to notice. I am transcribing this account from the Arbitration Bureau's internal after-action report, filed 9 days after the conclusion of Proceeding 4466R, colloquially known as the Sarani hearing. The report was never intended for public release. Its existence was confirmed during a records audit conducted by the Bureau's own Oversight Commission 18 months after the events described. I include this framing because the Bureau's own words describe what happened more precisely than any outside account could, and because Kale Sarani herself never gave a public statement about the proceeding. She never needed to. The record speaks for itself, and the record is devastating. Proceeding 4466R concerned the formal delisting of the Rithani, a species of roughly 4 billion souls occupying 3 star systems along the hegemony's outer administrative boundary. The Rithani had been hegemonic members for 1100 standard years. Their annual tribute assessments were current. Their cultural compliance indices met every threshold the Bureau measured. Their delegation had attended every plenary session for the last 2 centuries without a single recorded absence. By every metric the hegemony used to define a species in good standing, the Rithani qualified. None of that mattered. The Bureau's restructuring directorate had flagged the Rithani systems for what it called administrative consolidation. In hegemonic legal vocabulary, that term carried precise operational meaning: the dissolution of local governance structures, the reassignment of trade licenses to hegemonic preferred contractors, and the compulsory relocation of approximately 600 million individuals from their primary agricultural world to designated resettlement zones on 2 marginal moons at the far edge of Rithani territorial space. The moons had thin atmospheres, limited arable surface, and no existing infrastructure beyond automated atmospheric processors installed during a survey expedition 40 years earlier and never maintained since. Resettlement timelines in prior consolidation proceedings had averaged 11 years. Mortality rates among relocated populations during those timelines had never been publicly reported. They existed in the Bureau's internal actuarial records, classified under a filing code that required senior directorate clearance to access. Kale Sarani would eventually obtain those numbers. They would keep her awake for 3 consecutive nights when she did. The Rithani delegation had filed a formal objection through the Bureau's standard appellate pathway. It had been logged, stamped, assigned a docket number, and placed in the queue behind 11 other pending matters. Estimated time to preliminary review, 14 standard months. The consolidation order's implementation timeline began in 9. The hearing itself, the one that would formally dismiss the Rithani objection and ratify the consolidation order, was scheduled to last 2 hours. The Bureau had allocated 3, to allow for opening ceremonial formalities and the procedural reading of the consolidation order's full text. No one in the Bureau expected complications. Consolidation hearings were administrative exercises, not contested proceedings. The outcome was determined before the judges entered the chamber. The hearing was a formality. The objection was a formality. The Rithani's presence was a formality. The entire apparatus existed to provide the appearance of process to a conclusion that had been reached months ago in a directorate office. Kale Sarani arrived at the Velhari arbitration complex 40 minutes before the session opened. She was not tall. She was not physically imposing. The Bureau security log described her as human female, medium build, dark hair secured at the nape, carrying one standard data case and no identifiable weaponry or recording devices. She wore a plain dark jacket over a collarless shirt, neither military nor diplomatic in cut, and low flat-soled shoes that made no sound on the polished stone of the atrium floor. She carried no insignia. She presented no credentials at the outer gate beyond her commercial license, which granted access to the complex's public areas, including the observation galleries of active hearing chambers. She walked through the atrium of the arbitration complex, a soaring cathedral of pale Velhari stone and brushed alloy, rising 6 stories to a great vaulted glass dome that admitted broad shafts of morning light from the planet's twin suns. Holographic display panels along the curved walls showed docket schedules and session assignments in glowing science script. Administrative staff in gray tunics moved between offices with the unhurried precision of people who had been performing the same routines for decades. A pair of Velhari security officers, their elongated cranial ridges prominent above deep-set gray eyes, scanned her license chip and let her pass without comment. She was the 14th person to enter through the public access corridor that morning. None of the other 13 warranted a second glance either. She entered the public gallery of hearing chamber 14. She chose a seat in the 3rd row near the center aisle, where she had a clear sightline to both the judicial bench and the respondent's table below. She opened her data case. She removed a single tablet. She placed it face down on the narrow gallery rail in front of her. She folded her hands in her lap. Her expression was composed and unremarkable, the face of a woman waiting for something routine to begin. She waited. The Bureau did not notice her. There was no reason to. The gallery could seat 300 observers. On the morning of proceeding 4466R, it held 11. 4 junior clerks from unrelated divisions fulfilling continuing education observation requirements, a pair of trade correspondents from a hegemonic news syndicate covering the docket calendar for a quarterly summary, a retired Velhari magistrate who attended hearings out of long habit, 3 Rithani family members who had traveled from the outer systems to witness the proceeding that would determine the fate of their world, and 1 human woman with a data tablet who had not been invited and whose name appeared on no participant list. The Velhari hegemony was not a democracy. It was not a federation. It was not a republic, a parliament, a cooperative, or a consensus body. It was a layered administrative structure governed by a permanent civil service of extraordinary depth and self-referential complexity, operating under a charter that had been revised, annotated, subannotated, interpreted, reinterpreted, and cross-referenced over the course of 9,000 years, until it resembled less a constitution than a living geological formation. Strata upon strata of precedent, each layer bearing the weight of the ones above it, each layer compressing the ones below into something harder and less accessible with every passing century. The hegemony's strength, its leaders said, was its process. Its institutional histories said so. Its charter's preamble said so. The phrase most commonly inscribed above the entrance to hegemonic judicial chambers was, "The law does not see species. The law sees standing." Decisions were not made by passion, by personality, or by political pressure. They were made by procedure. Every action had a docket number. Every ruling had a citation chain. Every species within the hegemonic fold had theoretical recourse to the same body of administrative law, the same appellate pathways, the same notarized forms filed through the same processing centers, and reviewed by the same impartial arbiters. That was the theory. The hegemony believed it the way a person believes something they have never had cause to test, deeply, institutionally, with the serene confidence of certainty that has never encountered a contrary fact. The practice, as Cale Sarani had spent 11 years discovering, was that the word standing was defined, interpreted, and administered by the people who already had it. She had not always cared. That fact is important, and the after-action report noted it with a tone that read, between its careful institutional lines, as bewilderment. The Bureau could not quite reconcile the woman who sat in the gallery that morning with the woman whose earliest correspondence with the hegemonic system had been a routine tariff classification query filed on behalf of a small human freight cooperative 7 standard years before the Rithani consolidation was even proposed. Cale Sarani had come to Velhari Space as a contract negotiator for a mid-tier human shipping firm called Corwin Transit, which operated 4 cargo vessels along the hegemony's outer trade lanes. Her job was to secure docking permits, argue tariff classifications, untangle customs disputes, and navigate the hegemony's vast administrative apparatus on behalf of clients who could not afford a Velhari-trained advocate. It was unglamorous work. She was competent at it. She filed her documents on time. She learned the correct forms. She addressed Velhari officials with the proper honorifics and in the proper sequence. She did not, by any available metric, harbor strong feelings about the hegemony's internal governance or the way it treated its member species. She was there to move cargo through the system, and the system, from her professional vantage point, was complex but functional. The Rithani changed that. Not dramatically. Not in a single thunderclap of moral awakening. The shift was slower and quieter than any dramatic narrative could honestly capture, the kind of change that happens when a person sees a pattern clearly for the first time and discovers that the pattern was always there, and that once it is seen, it cannot be unseen. Her firm had subcontracted with a Rithani agricultural cooperative called the Veshay Collective, based on Rithan Prime. The work was routine: shipping manifests, cold chain certifications, customs pre-clearances for perishable biological cargo bound for hegemonic distribution hubs. She traveled to Rithan Prime twice in the first year of the contract. She ate meals with the cooperative's administrators in a long, low hall of weathered stone overlooking terraced hillsides of dense violet grain that ran in curved rows down to a river valley so deep that its floor was lost in blue haze. She learned, in passing conversation, that a particular Rithani family had tended a particular terrace for 9 generations, and that the Rithani measured time and wealth not in currency or standard cycles, but in seasons tended. In the depth and continuity of the roots a family had put into a specific piece of ground. She learned their word for it. It did not translate directly into any human language. The closest approximation she could construct was standing soil, meaning earth that recognized the hands that worked it, ground that had been shaped by a family's presence so completely that it could not be meaningfully separated from them, any more than a river could be separated from the channel it had carved. When the Restructuring Directorate's preliminary assessment flagged Rithan Prime for potential consolidation, Cale noted it in a quarterly status report to Corwin Transit and moved on. Preliminary assessments were common. The Directorate issued dozens per fiscal cycle. Most never advanced past the initial review stage. She gave it 2 sentences in her report and turned to the next docking permit dispute on her queue. This assessment advanced. The Veshay Collective's leadership asked her, not through formal channels but over a shared meal on the terrace overlooking the valley, whether there was anything in hegemonic law that could slow the process down. Give them time. Let them prepare an appeal that the Bureau might actually consider. Cale told them honestly that she did not know. She was a trade negotiator. Administrative consolidation law was outside her professional expertise. She recommended that they retain a Velhari licensed advocate, someone who knew the Bureau's procedures from the inside. They told her they had tried. 3 Velhari advocacy firms had declined the case. 2 had cited conflicts of interest. which in practice meant that they had directorate clients and could not afford to be seen challenging a consolidation order. The third firm had simply not returned their communications. The Rithani delegation's own legal advocacy office, which had once employed 12 full-time staff, had been defunded during a previous round of administrative streamlining and never reconstituted. Kale said she was sorry, she meant it, she finished her meal, she filed her quarterly report, she returned to her docking permit work aboard the transit station. For 2 standard months she did nothing else. The Rithani assessment moved from preliminary to active review. A timeline was published. Implementation planning began. Then the Directorate published its full consolidation plan, the operational document that would govern the dissolution of Rithani governance and the forced relocation of 600 million people. And a copy was automatically forwarded to Kale's commercial terminal, because the Veshai Collective was listed as an affected trade partner of a hegemonic licensed commercial entity. She read it. The plan was 240 pages long. Kale read every page. She read the annexes. She read the regulatory citations. She read the cross-references to prior consolidation proceedings and the impact assessments those proceedings had generated. Assessments that described outcomes in the flat administrative language of population metrics, resettlement completion rate, resource access transition index, post-relocation demographic stabilization period. She read the mortality tables buried in an appendix labeled Historical Resettlement Outcomes, Administrative Summary. She read the footnotes to the mortality tables, which explained the Bureau's methodology for distinguishing between consolidation attributable mortality and ambient background mortality in relocated populations, a distinction that consistently reduced the reported numbers by a factor she found difficult to look at for long. She read the Veshai Collective's name on the affected entities list, line 4221 of 6800. She read the coordinates of the terrace where she had eaten meals with people she knew by name, listed as Agricultural Zone R7, scheduled for decommission in Phase 3 of the resettlement timeline. What she found in the plan was not a scandal. It was not corruption in the dramatic, prosecutable sense. There were no bribes. There were no secret deals. There were no conspiracies, no hidden agendas, no villains in darkened chambers. There was something quieter, and she would decide over the course of the following weeks, immeasurably worse. There was indifference. The restructuring directorate had followed its own procedures with impeccable precision. Every form had been filed on time. Every timeline had been observed to the letter. Every regulatory threshold had been met. Every notification had been issued through the proper channels. The consolidation of the Rithani systems was, by every internal metric the Bureau used to evaluate its own performance, a model proceeding. Efficient, orderly, properly documented, it would have scored well on a quality review. The problem was that the procedures themselves had been written, over centuries of quiet revision and technical adjustment, to produce exactly this outcome. The thresholds had been calibrated to make consolidation easy and objection functionally impossible. The appellate pathways that theoretically gave affected species legal recourse were so encumbered with filing requirements, standing prerequisites, jurisdictional constraints, timing windows, and documentation standards that no species had successfully used them to reverse a consolidation order in over 300 standard years. The system's own records confirmed this. It was not hidden. It simply was not discussed, the way a building's foundation is not discussed by the people who live on its upper floors. The system worked. It worked precisely as designed, and what it was designed to do was erase a people from their own soil without anyone having to raise their voice, make an individual decision, or accept personal responsibility for the outcome. Kale Sarani closed the document. She sat in her rented quarters on Velhari Transit Station 11, staring at the bulkhead wall of her cabin, for what her personal log later recorded as 4 hours and 12 minutes. She did not eat. She did not sleep that night. She sat with the closed document on her terminal screen and a single word repeating itself behind her eyes: decommission. In the morning, she opened a new query on the Bureau's public archive and requested a complete copy of the hegemonic Charter of Administrative Proceedings. The charter was 11,000 pages long. She read it. 11 years. That was how long it took. The after-action report recorded the span with a tone that, for a document of its restrained institutional type, approached visible disbelief. 11 standard years of filings, requests, denials, refilings, administrative appeals, procedural motions, standing challenges, jurisdictional inquiries, credential applications, form corrections, citation chain verification, archival access requests, and correspondence with Bureau processing offices on 4 different worlds. 11 years of learning, a legal system that had been built over 9 millennia by a species whose concept of administrative precision made human bureaucracy look like children scratching marks on a wall. She did not do it alone, but she did it without institutional support. The Human Consular Office on Velhari Station, a small facility with a staff of 9 and a diplomatic mandate focused entirely on trade relations, declined to sponsor her efforts. The consul, a practical man named Haverford, told her frankly that humanity's commercial relationship with the hegemony was complex, mutually lucrative, and far more important in his professional judgment than a single consolidation proceeding involving a species most humans had never heard of. He was not unkind about it. He was honest. He said he understood her concern. He said the Rithani situation was unfortunate. He wished her well and asked her, politely but clearly, not to create a diplomatic incident. Cale did not argue with him. She did not appeal to his conscience or his sense of justice or his duty. She simply stopped asking and did the work herself. She funded it through continued contract negotiation, the same docking permits and tariff classifications she had always done, now compressed into the margins of days spent in the Bureau's archives, its records offices, its filing centers, its public access terminals. She took fewer contracts. Her income dropped by half, then by more. She moved from her rented quarters on Velhari Station to a smaller unit in the station's lower commercial ring, where the ventilation was unreliable and the lighting hummed at a frequency that made her teeth ache during the early hours. She did not complain about it. She did not mention it in any correspondence. It was not relevant to the work. The work consumed her the way weather consumes a coastline. Not in a single dramatic storm, but in the daily erosion of everything that was not the work itself. Her social contacts narrowed. The handful of human contractors and freight operators she had known on Velhari Station stopped inviting her to the quarterly trade dinners because she had declined 4 in a row. The last invitation had come with a note from a woman she had once considered a friend. "Cale, we worry. You look thin. Whatever this project is, it isn't worth disappearing over." Cale read the note, appreciated the concern, and did not reply. She was not disappearing. She was reading. Her former employer, Corwin Transit, terminated her retainer in the 4th year. The letter was cordial. It thanked her for 7 years of competent service and noted that her reduced availability no longer aligned with the firm's operational needs. They wished her well. They recommended 2 replacement negotiators, both of whom were capable and neither of whom had ever read the hegemonic charter past the table of contents. Cale acknowledged the termination, transferred her active case files, and returned to the archives the following morning. There were moments when she questioned herself. The after-action report did not record them, but anyone who has spent years on a task that no one asked for and no institution supports has experienced the specific loneliness of working toward a goal that no one else considers real. She would sit in the Bureau's public archive, surrounded by centuries of accumulated administrative procedure rendered in glowing Velhari script on screen after screen, and the sheer weight of the system would press against her chest like a physical thing. 9,000 years of precedent, 9,000 years of institutional certainty, and one human woman with a commercial license and a conviction she could not have articulated if pressed, because it was not an argument. It was not a legal theory. It was the simple, stubborn refusal to accept that a system that claimed to operate by rules could not be held to those rules by anyone willing to read them. The Rithani did not ask her to continue. They had not asked her to begin. The Veshai collective's communication with her had become sporadic by the third year, not from indifference but from the quiet resignation of people who had watched their own legal advocates fail and who could not quite bring themselves to invest hope in a human trade consultant's solitary effort. When she sent them updates, which she did on a quarterly schedule as regular as the filing deadlines she met, the replies were courteous and brief. They thanked her. They wished her health. They did not ask how much longer. Dreenath Vasho, the blind Rithani legal scholar, once asked her why she was doing this. They were sitting in his quarters on Rithan Prime during one of her annual visits, the evening light from the twin suns slanting through narrow windows and falling across the worn stone table between them. His clouded eyes were turned toward her general direction. His voice was careful, not accusatory, genuinely curious. "The Veshai did not hire you," he said. "Your government does not support you. Your former employer released you. You have no obligation." Kale was quiet for a long time. She could hear the wind moving through the grain terraces outside, a sound like distant breathing. "I read the plan," she said finally. "The consolidation plan. There's a line in the annex. It says Agricultural Zone R7, scheduled for decommission in Phase 3. That's the terrace where I ate dinner with people who told me about their grandmothers. The word decommission is on the same line as a place where someone's family has been growing food for 9 generations." She paused. "If I stop reading, that word stays on that line. And eventually it stops being a word and becomes a thing that happens to real people. And I will have known it was coming, and I will have had the ability to look for a way to stop it, and I will have chosen not to." Vasho was silent. After a moment, he nodded once slowly and reached for the next section of the charter they had been reviewing. That conversation was not in the after-action report. It was reconstructed from Vasho's personal correspondence, released by his family after his death, which occurred 14 months before the hearing he had spent 4 years helping Kale prepare for. He never saw the outcome. The last letter he wrote to Kale, dictated to his niece because his hands had become too unsteady to operate a terminal, contained a single instruction: read them their own words. They cannot argue with their own words. She kept the letter. It was the only personal item she carried with her into the arbitration complex on the morning of proceeding 4466R. She learned Velhari administrative law, the way a person learns a language by total immersion. Haltingly at first, making elementary errors that drew patient corrections from filing clerks who did not understand why a human trade consultant was requesting archival access to 900-year-old regulatory frameworks. Then with increasing fluency, as the structure of the system began to reveal its internal logic. Then over years, with a native speaker's ear for the silences, for the gaps between what the words said and what they were used to mean. The Veshai collective helped where it could. They sent her historical records, harvest data, demographic surveys, generational land tenure documents that trace the cultivation of specific terraces back through centuries. A Rithani legal scholar named Dreenath Vasho, elderly and nearly blind, long retired from the Rithani delegation's own now-defunct legal office, agreed to teach her. He could not read the texts himself. His eyesight had failed years ago, but he had spent his career studying the hegemonic charter, and he carried entire sections of it in his memory with the precision of a man who had once believed that the law would protect his people if only someone understood it well enough. He spent 4 months teaching Cale the difference between hegemonic statutory law and hegemonic customary law. It was a distinction the Bureau itself frequently blurred, sometimes deliberately, sometimes out of institutional habit so old it had become invisible. A non-Velhari practitioner would never notice the blur without being shown where to look. Vasho showed her. He recited the relevant charter passages from memory, his clouded eyes fixed on a middle distance, his voice steady and precise, and Cale cross-referenced each passage against the current charter text on her terminal. The discrepancies were small. Individually, none of them rose to the level of a clear violation. They were the kind of quiet adjustments that accumulate over centuries in any large institution. A threshold shifted here, a definition narrowed there, a procedure that once required public review reclassified as internal housekeeping. But together they formed a pattern, and the pattern had a shape, and the shape told a story. It was the story of a system that had slowly, methodically, and without any single conspiratorial act, rewritten its own rules to make its power unchallengeable while preserving the appearance of fairness like a shell around a hollow center. Cale showed the pattern to Vasho during their last working session together, 6 months before his health declined past the point of sustained concentration. She had organized it into a timeline, 63 amendments to the Charter's procedural framework over 400 years, each one small enough to pass under housekeeping authority, each one tightening the conditions under which a consolidation could be challenged. No single amendment was dramatic. No single amendment would have attracted scrutiny. But plotted in sequence, they described a curve as clear and deliberate as an engineering diagram. The system had not drifted into injustice. It had been adjusted into it, one quiet revision at a time, by people who understood precisely what they were doing, and who relied on the fact that no one would ever read all 63 amendments in sequence and see the shape they formed. Vasho listened to her describe it. His clouded eyes were still. When she finished, he said nothing for a long time. "The Charter's authors knew," he said finally. 9,000 years ago, when they wrote this, they anticipated that someone might do exactly what has been done. That is why Article 1142 exists. They built a door into the system for the person who would one day need to challenge it. And then, over centuries, everyone forgot the door was there. Cale did not respond to that. She did not need to. The door existed. She had found it. The question was whether it still opened. She spent the next 3 years testing every hinge. Cale's standing requests were denied 4 times. She filed each subsequent request with additional documentation addressing the specific procedural grounds cited in the previous denial. Each denial cited a different deficiency. She corrected each deficiency and refiled. The pattern itself told her something. A system that found a new reason to say no each time she fixed the old reason was not evaluating her filings on their merits. It was looking for reasons to close the door. She kept filing. The Bureau's processing clerks began to recognize her name on the incoming queue. One of them, according to a footnote in the after-action report, described her to a colleague as persistent but not disruptive. Another clerk, in a separate communication, noted that the human consultant's filings were technically flawless, which was recorded as a factual observation and not as a compliment. She was neither persistent nor disruptive. She was reading. She was reading the way a geologist reads a cliff face, layer by layer, looking for the fault line that the surface refused to show. She found it in the 7th year. The fault line was Regulatory Framework 9C. It was not a dramatic discovery. There was no single moment of revelation, no flash of insight, no hand striking a desk. It emerged gradually from the sediment of cross-references, from the patient comparison of charter requirements against administrative resolutions, from the quiet work of matching what the system said it required against what it had actually done. Framework 9C was one of 32 regulatory frameworks adopted during the current assessment period by the Bureau's Administrative Rules Committee. It had replaced Framework 7A, which had governed consolidation proceedings for 211 years. The replacement had been classified as a procedural update under the Bureau's Internal Housekeeping Authority, Classification Code H7. Cale read the old framework. She read the new one. She read the charter provisions governing the adoption of regulatory frameworks. She read them again. She read the definitions section of the charter, where terms like housekeeping authority and sovereign standing were defined with the precision of a language built over millennia to be exact. Then she put the pieces together, and the picture they formed was simple, and it was damning, and it had been sitting in plain view for centuries. It took her 3 more years to confirm it. 3 years of tracing every citation chain, verifying every cross-reference, testing every interpretation against every possible counter-reading, ensuring that she had not made a single error that the Bureau could use to dismiss her work. She filed her evidence through the Bureau's own system 9 days before the scheduled hearing. She used the Bureau's own forms. She followed every procedure. She met every requirement. The Bureau's system did what it was designed to do. It logged her filing, stamped it, assigned it a docket number, and placed it in a review queue where it would wait 14 months for preliminary assessment. By then, the Rithani would already have been relocated. Their terraces would already be scheduled for decommission. But Cale had not filed the evidence because she expected anyone to read it in time. She had filed it because Article 1142 of the Hegemonic Charter required only that the filing exist, not that it be reviewed. Article 1142, a provision so old that the Bureau's own legal reference system classified it as archival. It had been invoked fewer than 30 times in 9,000 years. The last invocation had been 400 years ago. It was the kind of provision that exists in the deep strata of a legal system, the way a fossil exists in rock, a remnant of an earlier era when the Charter's authors had anticipated, with remarkable foresight, that the system they were building might one day need to be challenged by someone it had not invited to speak. The morning of Proceeding 4466R, the Bureau's 3-judge panel entered hearing Chamber 14 at the appointed hour. The chamber was a broad semicircular hall of pale Velhari stone, the curved tiered seating rising in rows behind the judicial bench, holographic display panels glowing with pale cyan light along the walls, the great glass dome overhead admitting the warm gold of the planet's twin suns. Through the dome, against a bright morning sky scattered with high cirrus, the silhouettes of 3 Velhari administrative vessels were visible in standard orbit, dark angular shapes suspended against the blue. The judges settled into their seats with practiced ease. 3 senior Velhari arbiters in layered dark gray robes with geometric silver threading at the collar and shoulders, elongated cranial ridges prominent above deep-set gray eyes, 4-fingered hands folded on the polished surface of the bench. They carried the posture of officials for whom the next 2 hours held no surprises. The Rithani delegation occupied the respondents' table below and to the left of the bench. 7 individuals in formal dark garments, their wide amber eyes and scaled olive-green skin showing the visible strain of people who had traveled 3 systems to attend a proceeding they expected to lose. Their lead advocate, a young Rithani named Sarath, had prepared an opening statement. He had spent weeks on it. It was eloquent. It was heartfelt. It described the Rithani relationship with their homeworld in terms that, under any system that valued substance over procedure, would have been devastating to hear. Under the Bureau's procedural rules, it was irrelevant. Prelate Jorath, the restructuring directorate's representative, sat at the opposing table with 2 assistants and a data terminal. He was experienced, methodical, and unhurried. His brief was 17 pages long. He had reviewed the applicable statutory framework, confirmed the directorate's compliance, and prepared responses to the 3 most likely objections. He expected the hearing to conclude well inside the allocated time. The senior judge called the session to order. The Rithani advocate Sarth stood and began to speak. He spoke for 22 minutes. He described the terraces and the valleys and the river that ran through them. He described the generations that had worked that soil and the generations that would not if the order stood. He used the word that meant standing soil, and when he said it, his voice broke once and he paused and composed himself and continued. The judges listened with courtesy. Their expressions did not change. They had heard statements like this before. They would hear them again. The statement was entered into the record. The senior judge thanked Sarth for his remarks. He invited Prelate Jorath to present the directorate's position. Jorath stood. He adjusted the hem of his robe. He touched his data terminal to activate his brief. He drew a breath. "If the panel will permit," said a voice from the public gallery, "I wish to invoke Article 1142 of the Hegemonic Charter of Administrative Proceedings." The chamber went silent. Not gradually, not in a ripple of fading murmurs. The silence was instant, absolute, the kind that falls when a sound enters a room that does not belong in it. Every head in the chamber turned. The judges turned. Jorath turned, his hand still resting on his terminal. The Rithani delegation turned, confusion on their faces. The clerks turned. The trade correspondents turned. The retired magistrate sat forward. The 3 Rithani family members turned, not understanding what had been said but reading the sudden tension in every Velhari body in the room. In the 3rd row of the public gallery, a human woman in a dark jacket was standing. She held a data tablet in one hand at her side. Her posture was straight but not rigid. Her expression was calm. "Identify yourself," said the senior judge. Cale Sarani, independent legal consultant, registered under Hegemonic Commercial Code, license number 47729X. "You are not a party to these proceedings." "No," said Cale. Her voice was level. It carried across the chamber without effort, not raised but clear. "I am not a party. Article 1142 does not require party status. It requires only that the invoking individual hold a valid hegemonic commercial license and demonstrate material knowledge of a procedural deficiency bearing on the equitable administration of the proceeding in question. I hold the license. I have the knowledge. I am invoking the article." The senior judge looked at his 2 colleagues. One of them, Judge Vithari, consulted her terminal for 11 seconds, read the text of Article 1142, and nodded once. The article existed. The right it described existed. The panel had no procedural basis for denial. "You have 60 seconds to state the deficiency," said the senior judge. Cale did not need 60 seconds. The Restructuring Directorate's Consolidation Order cites Regulatory Framework 9C, subsection 14, as its statutory authority for the administrative consolidation of the Rithani systems. That framework was adopted by administrative resolution in the 3rd year of the current assessment cycle. It superseded the prior Framework 7A, which had governed consolidation proceedings for 211 years. She paused one beat. The silence held. Framework 7A required that any consolidation affecting a member species with a continuous membership record exceeding 500 standard years be reviewed under the enhanced scrutiny standard. That standard mandated 3 conditions: an independent impact assessment conducted by parties outside the directorate, a 60-day public comment period with open submissions, and the affirmative vote of a 3/4 supermajority of the Bureau's full arbitral panel. Not a 3-judge subcommittee. The full panel. Prelate Jorath's fingers had stopped moving on his terminal. Framework 9C eliminated the enhanced scrutiny standard entirely. The resolution adopting it was passed by the Bureau's Administrative Rules Committee, a body of 7 permanent Velhari appointees. It was not submitted for a plenary vote. It was filed as a procedural update under the Bureau's Internal Housekeeping Authority, Classification Code H7, which governs routine adjustments to filing procedures, scheduling protocols, and administrative formatting standards. She raised the data tablet slightly. She did not look at it. However, the Hegemonic Charter of Administrative Proceedings, Article 3307, Subsection 2, Clause 9, states that no regulatory framework affecting the sovereign standing of a member species, with a continuous membership record exceeding 500 standard years, may be adopted, amended, superseded, or reclassified without three conditions: a plenary vote of the full Arbitration Bureau, recording of that vote in the public register, and a 90-day ratification window with published notice to all affected member species. She lowered the tablet. Framework 9C was adopted without a plenary vote. It was not recorded in the public register. No 90-day ratification window was observed. No published notice was sent to the Rithani or to any other affected member species. The resolution was classified under housekeeping authority that, per the Charter's own definitions, does not extend to matters affecting sovereign standing. The silence in the chamber was structural. Every Velhari official in the room was processing the same realization and arriving at the same conclusion. Kale looked at the senior judge. Her expression had not changed. The statutory authority cited in the consolidation order does not legally exist. The proceeding has no valid basis. The Rithani objection is sustained by operation of Article 884, which provides that no administrative action may proceed under a framework adopted in violation of Charter ratification requirements. She sat down. The after-action report described the next 4 hours with the restrained precision of an institution discovering, in real time and in a public chamber, that a load-bearing wall in its own structure had been quietly removed. Prelate Jorath objected. He objected formally, methodically, and with the full technical weight of the Directorate's legal apparatus. He cited 17 precedents in which the Administrative Rules Committee had adopted regulatory frameworks under housekeeping authority without plenary review. He challenged Kale's standing to invoke Article 1142, arguing that a commercial licensee's material knowledge could not extend to charter-level constitutional questions. He requested that the panel dismiss the invocation and proceed with the hearing. The panel did not dismiss it. Judge Vithari addressed the standing challenge first. Article 1142's language, she noted, did not limit the scope of the deficiency that could be raised. It required only that the deficiency bear on the equitable administration of the proceeding. A charter-level violation in the statutory framework governing the proceeding met that standard. The challenge was denied. Jorath pivoted. He argued that the housekeeping classification had been applied consistently for centuries, that the Rules Committee's authority had never been questioned, and that retroactive invalidation would create chaos across dozens of active proceedings. Judge Vithari agreed that it might. She noted that administrative convenience had never, in 9,000 years of hegemonic jurisprudence, been accepted as a basis for waiving a charter ratification provision. She asked the Directorate to identify the specific charter provision authorizing the Rules Committee to adopt frameworks affecting sovereign standing without plenary review. Jorath consulted his terminal, his assistants consulted theirs, the chamber waited. The provision did not exist. Jorath requested a recess. The senior judge granted 90 minutes. The chamber did not empty. The Rithani delegation sat at their table. Sorath's hands were pressed flat against its surface, his amber eyes fixed on the human woman in the gallery. In the gallery, Kale sat with her tablet face down on the rail and her hands folded in her lap. She did not check her device. She did not look at anyone. She waited. When the panel returned, the senior judge's cranial ridges had paled by 2 visible shades. His colleagues showed the same pallor. They had spent the recess reading what Kale had read. They had found what she had found. The senior judge spoke for 3 minutes. The proceeding was suspended. A full plenary review of Framework 9C was ordered. The Oversight Division was instructed to audit all frameworks classified under housekeeping authority during the current assessment period. Prelate Jorath requested an immediate appeal. The senior judge noted that an appeal required the identification of an alternative valid statutory framework under which the consolidation could proceed. No such framework existed. The appeal had no vehicle. Jorath sat down. The silence that followed was not the productive silence of a chamber waiting for the next procedural step. It was the silence of a room whose occupants were each, independently, arriving at the same understanding and finding that it altered the shape of everything they thought they knew about the institution they served. The junior clerks in the gallery had stopped taking notes. One of them, a young Velhari woman whose after-action interview would later be included in the report's appendices, described the moment as the sound of a building discovering it has no foundation. She had entered the arbitration bureau 18 months earlier. She had believed, as she had been trained to believe, that the system was self-correcting, that its procedures, however complex, were internally consistent, that the charter's protections were real. She sat in the gallery and watched that belief come apart in the space of 90 seconds, taken apart not by an accusation or a protest, but by a citation chain read aloud by a woman who had simply done what the system claimed anyone could do. The trade correspondents were writing furiously. One of them would later publish an account that described Cale's intervention as the most consequential 60 seconds in modern hegemonic legal history. The description was accurate, though Cale herself would have objected to the word consequential. She had not set out to create consequences. She had set out to read the rules. The retired magistrate in the gallery, a Velhari named Counsel Emeritus Drethan, who had served on the Arbitration Bureau's appellate bench for 47 years before retiring, sat motionless in his seat. His cranial ridges had gone the pale gray of deep shock. He had presided over consolidation hearings. He had signed consolidation orders. He had done so under Framework 9C. The realization of what that meant, what it meant about every order he had signed, about every species whose objections he had dismissed using a statutory authority that had never been legally adopted, settled onto him with a weight that the after-action report, in a rare moment of understatement, described as professionally significant. He remained in his seat for 20 minutes after the chamber was formally adjourned. When he finally rose, he walked to the clerk's station and requested a complete record of every consolidation proceeding he had overseen during his tenure. The request was logged. It would take 4 months to fulfill. He read every page of every record. His subsequent letter to the Bureau's Oversight Commission, 7 pages long and written in the precise formal prose of a man who had spent a lifetime in the law, recommended a full retrospective audit of all consolidation proceedings conducted under Framework 9C and its predecessor frameworks adopted under housekeeping authority. The letter used the word unconscionable once. In 47 years of judicial correspondence, he had never used it before. In the respondent's area, Sorath was staring at the gallery. His prepared statement, the one he had worked on for weeks, was still on his tablet. He closed the file. His hands were shaking. The aftermath unfolded over months. The Bureau's plenary review, the first in over a century, convened 41 days after the hearing. It examined not only Framework 9C, but the 31 other regulatory frameworks adopted under housekeeping classification during the same period. 14 were found to have been adopted in violation of the Charter's ratification requirements. 7 of those 14 governed currently active proceedings affecting 11 member species. All 7 proceedings were suspended. The suspension sent tremors through the hegemony's administrative apparatus that were felt on worlds Cale had never visited and among species she had never met. On Dreenath IV, a aquatic species called the Morhani, whose coastal habitats had been scheduled for industrial repurposing under a consolidation order ratified 3 years earlier, received formal notification that the order was void. Their delegation's senior representative, a being whose name translated roughly as keeper of the title record, read the notification to an assembly of 11,000 gathered on a reef platform at dawn. The assembly was silent for a full minute. Then a sound rose from the water that human acoustic equipment would later classify as a harmonic resonance in the subsonic range, sustained for 4 minutes, audible through the hull of a monitoring vessel anchored 3 kilometers offshore. The vessel's crew did not know what the sound meant. The Morhani did. It was the oldest word in their language, older than writing, older than their recorded history. It meant something close to, "The current has turned." On 3 other worlds, similar scenes unfolded in forms appropriate to the species involved. Delegations that had exhausted their legal options and resigned themselves to displacement discovered, in the span of a single administrative notification, that the machinery of their dispossession had been built on a procedural fiction. The emotions involved were complex, and the after-action report, which was not designed to capture emotional nuance, recorded them only as significant diplomatic developments requiring coordinated response. But the communications that flooded the Bureau's intake systems in the weeks following the suspensions carried a tone that the processing clerks had never encountered in their careers. Not complaint, not petition, not the careful deference of species navigating a system that held power over them, but the frank, startled, raw-voiced gratitude of people who had been told their homes were gone, and then told in the next breath that the telling had been unauthorized. Several of those communications mentioned Cale Sarani by name. One, from the Morhani delegation, asked the Bureau to forward their regards. The Bureau's communications office was uncertain how to process this request. It did not fit any existing form category. They forwarded it anyway, in a plain envelope, to the registered address of a human commercial licensee on Velhari Transit Station 11. The Restructuring Directorate's Consolidation Authority was dissolved pending charter compliance review. The Directorate itself was placed under oversight by the Bureau's Compliance Division, a body that had existed on the organizational chart for 600 years and had never previously been staffed. Prelate Jorath resigned. 2 members of the Administrative Rules Committee retired. A third was reassigned. The Rithani remained on their worlds. Their terraces continued to grow. Their soil continued to hold the roots that families had tended for generations. The resettlement order was not modified or revised. It ceased to exist because the authority that had issued it had never been the authority it claimed to be. Cale Sarani filed no public statement. She gave no interviews. She declined 5 media requests with identical one-sentence responses. The Bureau's public records speak for themselves. She attended no subsequent hearings. She did not seek advocate credentials. She did not write a memoir. She returned to contract negotiation within 2 standard weeks. The Bureau's after-action report noted this with something that, in a less disciplined document, might have been described as respect. The Veshe Collective sent a communication to her registered address 4 months after the hearing, a physical package that had traveled 3 systems by courier. Inside was no text, no letter, a single printed image, the violet grain terraces of Rithan Prime at harvest, the valley full of light. In the lower corner, barely visible, a human figure stood on the terrace where Cale had once shared a meal. Whether she responded is not in the record. The Veshe Collective never spoke of it. The Velhari hegemony did not change overnight. It did not transform. It did not suddenly become just or equitable or self-aware. The system did not discover a conscience in the span of a single hearing. What it did was slower and quieter. It began, for the first time in centuries, to read its own charter, not as a reference document cited in support of conclusions already reached, but as a set of promises made in writing to the species that had agreed to live under them, promises that had never been checked against the reality of what the Bureau actually did. The plenary review lasted 8 months. Its report recommended permanent staffing of the Compliance Division, a public charter access archive available to all licensees regardless of species, mandatory plenary review of all frameworks affecting sovereign standing, and an independent appellate pathway for standing challenges requiring no institutional sponsorship. The last recommendation was called, in Bureau internal communications, the Sovereignty Provision. Kale was never consulted. The Bureau named it after her the way a geological formation is named after the person who identified the fault line, not as an honor, but as an acknowledgement that the fracture had always been there. The provision's practical effect was immediate and substantial. Within one standard year, 14 independent consultants, trade representatives, and licensed observers from 6 different species had used the new appellate pathway to file standing challenges in active proceedings. 11 of those challenges identified genuine procedural deficiencies. The Bureau's Compliance Division, now staffed with 42 full-time auditors, processed them with an efficiency that suggested the institution was capable of self-correction when the mechanism for correction actually existed. But the provision's deeper effect was something the Bureau's metrics could not measure and its reports could not describe. It was the effect of a single demonstrated fact, that the system's own rules, read carefully and applied honestly, could be used to hold the system accountable. That the charter was not merely decorative. That the promises written into it 9,000 years ago by people who had imagined, with extraordinary prescience, a future in which those promises might need to be enforced, were not dead words in an archive. They were alive. They had weight. They could bear the pressure of a real case brought by a real person on behalf of real people whose lives depended on whether those words meant what they said. The Bureau had spent centuries believing that its authority was its process. Kale Sovereignty had shown them something more uncomfortable, that their process was only as legitimate as their willingness to follow it, and that the moment someone outside the institution took the trouble to check, the distance between what they claimed and what they practiced became visible to everyone. That visibility was the Sovereignty Provision's true gift, not a new rule, not a new pathway, a mirror. One that the institution had not known it needed until a woman with no standing, no sponsorship, and no invitation held it up in a public chamber and asked the Bureau to look at its own reflection. Some institutions, when shown what they have become, turn away. The Velhari hegemony, to its credit and to its discomfort, did not. Whether that was because the evidence was too public to ignore, or because somewhere within the 9,000-year-old apparatus there remained a residual commitment to the principles it had been built to serve, the after-action report did not speculate. It simply recorded what happened next and left the interpretation to history. There is a line in the Bureau's communications log from the morning of the hearing. A message from a junior scheduling clerk to a colleague in the records office, sent 8 minutes after Kale invoked Article 1142. It read, "Who is she?" The records office replied 14 minutes later, "Nobody, a trade consultant with a commercial license. She has been filing requests for years." The clerk wrote back, "She just stopped the hearing." The records office did not reply. The Bureau's after-action report, in its final paragraph, used a phrase that Velhari administrative documents almost never employ. The Bureau's vocabulary is precise, technical, and stripped of evaluative language. Reports describe outcomes, not meanings. In 9,000 years, the Bureau's formal documents had never used the word grateful or indebted. The final paragraph read, "The intervention of the independent consultant is assessed as consequential to the Bureau's ongoing charter compliance obligations and to the integrity of the administrative framework as a whole." Consequential. In a 9,000-year legal tradition built on the conviction that no individual mattered more than the system, That was the nearest the institution had ever come to saying it owed someone something it could not repay. On Rathan Prime, the grain was growing. It would grow the next season, and the season after that, in soil that belonged to the people who had always tended it, not because a fleet had appeared through the dome, not because a government had threatened anyone, not because a diplomat had delivered a speech or a general had issued an ultimatum. Because one woman had read the rules, all of them, every page, every subsection, every footnote, and she had believed with the quiet, unremarkable, immovable conviction of a person who had decided that written words meant what they said, that those rules applied to everyone, even to the people who wrote them.